Good morning. Education ministers come and education ministers go. And there's no argument from political observers that the soft underbelly of the social credit government in Victoria is the crisis in education. Who knows what's happening to whom? For instance, yesterday, the new Minister of Education, Jim Hewitt, was at a press conference in Victoria over a shortage of all things, textbooks. Here's what happened.
Maybe I can move us up to 15, 16, 17 million dollars by going to the Excellence Education Fund. If that's what my school boards want, and if that's what they want, and I can get their support, I'll go to the Excellence in Education Fund. Isn't the end result of all this really making sure that the young people have the adequate textbooks and education system that we want to give them?
And here is Jim Hewitt, the new Minister of Education, and we'll have at him very shortly. Now, we're back at the battle of the drug manufacturers. The Canadian drug manufacturers, generic. The Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association of Canada, brand names, innovative, ethical, whatever you call them. They are the dearer, more expensive drugs. There is a move in Canada, as you know, to change the right of the generic drug manufacturers to copycat the big boys' drugs. And you heard from Jack Kay of the generic drugs, and today you're going to hear from Terry Mailloux of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association of Canada. You're also going to hear about the incentives offered by the drug companies, some to doctors and some to drug manufacturers, which may well put up the cost of our drugs, which are costing high enough as it is at the moment. And we're going to get the factual situation on that from Frank Archer of the Pharmacists Society of British Columbia. Towards the end of the program, we're going to look at a touchy problem. We all know there's lots of unemployment in Canada today, especially in the West, and that there is some fear that immigration is being overdone. But how does that affect your attitude towards the admission to Canada of refugees? We are number 3 in taking refugees throughout the world, I do believe, at the moment. And I have here Oystein Stabrun, who's the representative in Canada of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and Sharon Rusu, a consultant on the topic. But off the top this morning, we go into class, and I want attention, please, for Jim Hewitt, the Minister of Education, after the break. Under pressure from the public and the education system, the government announced a $110 million fund for excellence in education to be allocated to various districts by the decision of the government. And they threw in another $90 million to pick up the loss in business and commercial taxation last year. Mr. Hewitt, is it not a fact that right now, let's deal with textbooks first. I was quite shocked when I saw you on the air saying, we've got to have more money for textbooks and I'll take it from the Excellence in Education Fund. Surely that's not the right use of that fund.
Well, you'll notice I said if I had the support of the school boards. If the school boards are indicating to me that that is the best use of the Excellence in Education Fund, then I'm prepared to go for it. But I want to point out that on that leaked document that Mark Rose had, and I've got the balance of it, which he failed to report, in 86-87, the maximum figure was $22,500,000 for textbooks. There's 11 million some odd thousand in there. Next year, it drops from 22 million down to 12 million. The following year, it's at 14 million. And I said that we could go to the Excellence in Education Fund and maybe phase in over the 3 years. But it's not going to mean, as Mark Rose would lead you to believe, that there are going to be classes cut, that are going to be failure in the class. That's nonsense. That's
unless you
nonsense.
kick in this money for textbooks, you're going to be short of textbooks.
Well, we're short of textbooks, flow of textbooks. Last year, in 83, we had 11 million. In 84, we had 13 million. In 85, 86, we had 12 million. So we're still on the same flow. Now, I could move it from 12, and I'd like to move it up to 16 or 18, if I get the support of the school boards to go to that fund.
But what you're talking about is using your Excellence in Education Fund for basic operation of the schools.
Not at all.
Textbooks. What could be more basic
we
than
have
that?
$11 million in textbooks funding.
Let's go another one. 54 of the 75 school districts right now say they haven't got enough money and they're producing budgets way over what you're prepared to share in, correct?
Correct.
Is there any money this year for increases for teachers?
There's no money in the budget fiscal framework for increases to teachers in 1986-87. That's correct.
None at all. So therefore, all these school districts will have to go to additional property taxation if they want to maintain that budget level.
They have the ability to go to the property tax base, the residential property tax base within their school district. They also have the accountability to the taxpayer to say that we want to increase your taxes to pay increased wages for teachers. And you know as well as I that the Premier of this province said in his statement to the people, I want to create jobs in British Columbia, not increase wages of those who are already working.
Last year, your predecessor fired 2 school boards because they couldn't keep within the government's ordered budgets, correct?
That's correct.
Are you going to fire more school boards this year if they don't keep within, or will you be happy to see them going to local property owners and saying, here's a special mill rate to cover our cost of education?
Well, let me give you the strategy as it works. 15th of March, they submit their school budget to my ministry. That's their wish list. This is their optimum that they'd like to have. By the 20th of April, we've advised them of the provincial participation in that school budget. At that particular time, a year ago, Heinrich would give a directive saying this is what you could spend. We've amended the procedure to say you have the ability to tax. Once they know what our participation is, they can review their wish list, cull it down where they figure they should, where they feel there's an essential need to their local taxpayers, they can go to get adjustments or increases in taxes. I still say, Jack, that puts accountability at the local school board level. If they're going to increase teachers, and they're going to increase teachers' salary, give them wage increases, they better be prepared to the people who vote those school boards in to answer the question why. In fact, and you've been around as long as I've been around, what you're doing is turning the clock back to the bad old days when places, school districts with a good tax base could supply on additional residential taxation a better standard of education than the place up country with no big tax base, right? It's going to result in uneven levels of education in British Columbia. No, if you look back when the commercial industrial tax base, the non-residential tax base was collected by the local school boards, those school boards that had an industrial base could acquire a lot of tax revenue, and yet school boards in my area, places like Karameas or Kettle Valley, didn't have that ability. Correct. So we said, businesses don't have kids. Bring the money into the provincial government for redistribution on a fair and equitable arrangement under the fiscal framework to make sure all our kids are treated equal in this province. Good approach, sound approach. Except that right now, and you can take Vancouver School Board as an example, or some other ones too, the fact is that you're taking the business and commercial tax, you say you distribute it, but there are school districts which say that the education standard is falling and that they'll have to go to local taxation, correct? Well, that's what they're saying, and I'm saying that they have to look at very hard at their budgets, their wish list they put in after we advise them our participation. If I can take a minute. I wasn't going to do this to you, but I will. I hate these things. I don't know whether they don't mean anything. Well, this does. I guess my background in accounting, I'd like to play with charts. But this here shows the provincial expenditures, and let's just look at 86. Health, Education, Human Resources bill covers 70% plus of our total budget. The other here is interest on debt, economic incentives. After all the tough, hard things we've done in the areas that people accuse us of and not funding education, Jack, we're still almost $1 billion in the red. We're borrowing to buy groceries in British Columbia. For this year? Even after the tough things we've done. Now, all I'm saying to the taxpayer of this province, you put us in, and I think they agree with us, we've got to control this, we've got to be realistic in our funding, and if a school board wants more money, I'm quite prepared to look at it. I've got some additional money that the economy's provided in $110 million in excellence. Give me assistance, I'll be your advocate, I'll go to cabinet, I'll get some money, but we want to get the best return on our investment. But Jack, all our taxpayers are hurting over here. Everybody knows about the parlous financial trouble we're in. $1 billion in debt this year alone and all the rest of it. But if you want to be political, I've got no guarantee you're spending that money properly at all. I mean, I don't know if your priorities are right in any way, shape, or form. But you're saying that you are so broke that there will be no government-funded increases for teachers this year, no additional teachers this year, and little dribs and drabs out of your spare $110 million
to do whatever. Is that right?
I'm saying that even with the tough times we've come through, we've always maintained one goal: adequate funding of health, adequate funding of education, adequate funding for those people who can't take care of themselves in the human resources area. Over 70% of our budget goes out. If you're telling me we're not spending it wisely, I'd like to know where else we can get the money from.
No, I don't want to get into the political discussion on that. I merely want to get the precise picture from you. You're going to make sure everybody's got textbooks next year by taking the money out of the Excellence Fund if you have to. What about the rest of that fund? What's that going to be used for?
Well,
when's that going to be spent?
Well, we have the fund started 110 million. We put 15.5 million in to cover non-salary inflationary costs to school boards all across the province. Russ Fraser's tapped that fund on a couple of instances. If the school boards want me to go there with regards to textbooks, I'm prepared to go and fight for it and hopefully get an increase in funding.
But not for wages or anything like that?
Not for wages, 86, 87. It's hard, Jack, to tell a logger who's unemployed, or a construction worker that's only working part-time, or a businessman who is struggling to survive, that, hey, I'm going to raise your taxes because a public employee, and that's what a school teacher is, they're professional and I appreciate doing a good job, but how can I say to the taxpayer, we want to increase your taxes because we want to give more pay to the teacher?
Therefore, you're here this morning to tell us it's going to be as tight as ever next year and no major improvements in school financing. In fact, none.
Except the 110 million, which can be looked at, and to get the best return for that investment of 110 million.
And it'll be allocated on a project-by-project basis on the merit as decided by the Cabinet. Can you tell me any projects?
We've provided all school boards with this. I don't know if your people can see that.
Yes, they can.
Yeah.
How much it cost the taxpayer $1?
Well, it's a folder and it's nicely colored, but it's easy to read.
Your questions to Jim Hewitt, mine too, after the break. Let me see that. Here is the glossy government pamphlet on excellence in education. Here is a much drabber pamphlet put out by the teachers. Poverty in British Columbia. It is a most depressing learning aid book. And you know that your friends in COPE and the Vancouver School Board will agree with the BC Teachers Federation that what we should teach now in British Columbia is poverty, the gap between the rich and the poor, eating out of garbage cans. I'm a 14-year-old living on gain, and I'm discriminated against because I'm the only non-affluent person in the classroom. You'd like that taught by the teachers throughout BC, wouldn't you?
First of all, let me correct you. It's not put out by the teachers, it's put out by the Teachers Federation.
BC Teachers Federation.
I don't think there's a teacher in this province who would like to show that in the classroom. It is a, pardon my expression, it is a sick publication. It basically indicates that everything is doom and gloom and disaster. Great way to instruct our children coming out of school. It has a project in there, Jack, which I don't think any teacher would advocate. Project number 6, fast, drink water only for 2 or 3 days. There are people doing that involuntary in BC every month. Keep a journal of this experience. In our schools, we would instruct somebody's child to fast for 2 or 3 days without medical advice.
No, we would not.
It's a sick publication.
Anyway,
one more thing, because I got this. It's up to the local school board to determine where this goes into schools. Not up to me. But interesting enough, all the organizations they list, and there's 4 or 5 pages at the back, there's not one mention of the Ministry of Human Resources, which is set up in this province to assist those people who are in difficulty. But they do talk about action groups, they talk about the Federation of Labor, they talk about tenants' rights, DERA, BC Federation of Labor, Unemployment Action Centers. This has got something to do with students? I don't understand it.
Well, I mean, they don't want to plug human resources. They don't like human resources. But anyway, you're mad about this pamphlet. You think it's disgraceful.
I'm not mad. I think it's unfortunate that the Federation gets into that level of dialogue.
And you don't want any school district to teach with this, do you?
That's their decision, not mine.
They've got autonomy for that, if nothing else.
They have autonomy for that.
Let's go to the phones. Go ahead to Jim Hewitt.
Good morning, Mr. Webster. Mr. Hewitt, I'm not convinced that all this kerfuffle with the school system over the past few years has not been addressing a hidden political agenda. It doesn't really matter, because in your total incompetence with dealing with education over the past few years, you people have just created a disastrous situation. I'd like to know, I certainly don't believe your charts and graphs, and I think they're what increases there have been addressed to education has probably gone for things like expo pamphlets and everything else, which doesn't go through the expo budget, but instead appears through the education budget.
Give him a question.
I would like to ask him about the teachers' salaries. Now, you have them based on 84 levels in the fiscal framework. Are you going to readjust those figures upwards to 85, 86 levels? You certainly said that you didn't expect teachers to get an increase beyond that, but you certainly must acknowledge that there has been increases since 1984. And is it really fair to expect school districts to be only given funding for 84 levels when there has been a 1.5% increase, if that?
The caller is quite correct. The fiscal framework is looking at 84, 85 salary levels. Jack Heinrich very clearly, very specifically said there was no funds in the 85, 86 fiscal framework to cover increase in salaries of teachers.
Well, are you going to keep this 84?
You want to keep the 84 level?
And as a result, going through the process of negotiation, arbitration, and then CSP, there were adjustments given. I have met with school boards and I've talked to them and I said, look, it's approximately $18 million is what it is. And I said, look, if that's the case, I'm a new minister and I'm quite prepared to argue that point that I should maintain the 85, 86 salary level.
Well,
and I'm
certainly you have
prepared
to
do
acknowledge
that.
it. I mean, when are you going to acknowledge it? It's there. It has to be addressed. Is this what's going to come from the Fund of Excellence, so-called, and it just makes me ill?
Okay, there's a good question. Will the 18 million needed for the 85, 86 levels come out for the Fund of Excellence?
I'm prepared to go to the Fund of Excellence to get the 85, 86 levels. But the point, Jack, is simply this.
Just a minute, go on.
The point is simply this. School boards were told without any doubt that there was no monies in the 85, 86 budget. And they could have gone to PEC and argued very strongly that the provincial government's fiscal framework didn't allow for increases. As a result, they could have used that non-ability to pay.
They did do that argument.
Okay, ma'am, I think we've covered that fairly well in that the minister has said that he's prepared if the school boards want him to go for the funds for excellence for the extra $18 million to bring the teacher's salary up to 85, 86
Well, I'm sure that's news to a lot of school boards, and it'll be great. But, you know, this is absolutely insane, Mr. Hewitt.
Okay, ma'am. I don't think she's saying you're insane.
Can I do one more little? I'm going to do this because I think the taxpayer of this province has got to have the ability to notice what's happening. Average teacher salaries. Here's the consumer price index. In 80, 81, 10 or 12% increase, 17% increase in 82. There's the reason. And they're still, even though we've leveled off all the way through to 85, they're still well above the consumer price index. Jack, how can I ask for more money for teachers' salaries when the taxpayer of this province is suffering? I've got more responsibilities than just teachers' wages. I'm part of the cabinet and the government of this province.
Good point. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I have a comment and then a question. I too are concerned about the amount of money in the system, but it seems to me the whole question of quality isn't necessarily related to money. It's related to the training of the teachers. I heard a speaker last night who informed a parent group about training of teachers in this province, both at the pre-service and the in-service level. And I'm just wondering whether or not the ministry is planning on re-examining how we go about training teachers in the province and what we do to make sure that, say, specialist teachers in the school, learning assistance teachers and people like that are properly trained in this province.
Any plans?
Yes, it's a good point. It's teacher training and I guess teacher retraining or updating because of the way the technology is closing in on us. We're establishing a committee which is going to develop new criteria, if you will, to assist our teachers to be up to date and to give them better instruction abilities in the classroom. And that's going to call upon a lot of areas of society, i.e. the business community, the teaching community, those people involved in computers, etc.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Hewitt why he wouldn't meet with the parents who went to Victoria on St. Patrick's Day as part of the Metro Education Association delegation, and why he couldn't at least give us a date for a meeting if he was too busy, and why did he have to hide from us? We did not, as parents, have TV cameras with us.
Metro Education Association from Vancouver?
Yes.
Jim?
Well, first of all, I was sent a letter from this organization and then sent a telegram saying we are arriving at your office at 12:30 on Monday. And at Monday morning, I, as a minister responsible for the Systems Corporation, had a board meeting of the Systems Corporation. Didn't get into the legislature until 1:45, went immediately to the House, didn't avoid them, but I can tell the lady that the delegation arrived at my office. My staff advised me when I wasn't there, and they told me that they'd arrived with television cameras, etc. So I don't know where the lady was, but I can tell you that the press, the media were there to do the big show about boxing in the minister and all the accusations made. I did meet with 3 of that delegation later on. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they were from Maple Ridge, I believe, and they came in and we sat down and had a good talk.
That's not a bad answer, ma'am.
Well, I guess it's not quite good enough for me. I would like to have a date as a parent who went over from Vancouver about when he will meet with us.
Well, he met with you the other afternoon. I don't think you can blackjack him by turning up on his doorstep on a telegram. You can try it, but don't expect to get away with it every time. After the break. Mr. Hewitt, Minister of Education, have you any specific instructions or plans to clamp down on this outbreak of pedophilia? Maybe it's only the awareness that's brought it. And it would seem to me, Mr. Hewitt, that the system has failed totally. Even when people surfaced, there was no identification, there was no chasing, there was no complaints laid. Principals or teachers conned parents out of continuing with complaints. Are you going to give any special instructions to school districts on what they should have done and should do?
Yes. I have had a meeting with Jim Nielsen, Minister of Human Resources, Attorney General, myself, looking at a total review of the system and put into place for school boards and for superintendents and for principals the routine that must be followed with regards to child abuse in the schools. I've got to do 2 things. One, I've got to ensure that the parents of this province, when they send their kids to school, feel secure, that nothing's going to happen to that child. The other one, equally important, I think, that we don't want a witch hunt out there where an innocent teacher is unjustly accused. We've got to be very careful.
It's the same in every form of crime in our society. You've got to avoid malicious prosecution or unjust accusation. But on a prima facie case, surely the first thing the school district should be told to do is to call in the police.
It may well be that.
Because that's where they failed.
We've got to have a system, an early warning system, that stops it from continuing on and on and on. I can tell you that school board one school board I met that did have the gentleman that's in the news so much as an employee, are devastated as elected officials and are concerned about, Mr. Minister, how can this be stopped? You know, how can we have a system set up? They want to be sort of vindicated somewhat from their position. Emotionally, they feel drained because all this happened within their school district.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with the system right now. People just didn't use it.
Basically, but we've got to have a system set up provincially that says you must use it.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack. I wanted to know, why don't we, as British Columbians here, use our tax money, for instance, in projects like mega projects in education, rather than on highway maintenance, for instance? And why shouldn't the teachers have a raise increase? What do you call it at this present time? A freeze or a wage cut?
Well, if we're not allowing for increases, or we're saying to school boards that the fiscal framework doesn't allow for increases in 1986-87, then basically that is a message to say that the prime goal of the provincial government is job creation and not increased salaries for those who are already working. You know as well as I, we've got a tremendous unemployment problem in British Columbia. First priority.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack, and good morning, Mr. Hewitt.
Yes.
I've got 2 quick questions for you. First one, Mr. Hewitt, could you please explain to me the difference between a teacher's salary increase and a salary increment? And the second question is, why does the Vancouver School Board need an additional $10 million more than what your ministry says it needs? Who's right, and what's the difference? And how can you guys be out $10 million, or how can the school board be out $10 million?
Well, to deal with the last one first, I said by the 15th of March they must submit their school budgets. In many cases, the school budgets come in well above. It's their wish list. I'd say the Vancouver School Board is probably driven by a different drummer than most school boards because they're on a political track, if you will, because of their philosophy, and they're wanting to point the finger at the provincial government. So what's going to be the crunch is when it comes back to them to say this is all we can fund provincially, then they're going to have to rework their figures, and I'd suggest they'll work them down. Otherwise, if they bump up salaries to their teachers and pay these increases and add staff, etc., the local taxpayer in Vancouver is going to say why. And next November, when the election comes around, they may have to answer that question.
Next to $90 a home, the Cope School Board reckons.
Well, I think that's unfair because some of those people in those homes are unemployed, some are senior citizens on pensions.
But you really evaded the issue. After your strong commanding position of the past couple of years, now you back off and say you want to raise residential taxes, it's on your own head.
The reason for the ability to tax, Jack, was to allow them the flexibility to use, to get additional taxes for specifics within their school district. Something that applies to their school district. For example, in my area, in the Okanagan, maybe we want grade 11 or grade 12 instruction in agriculture. And so they put that in, and local taxpayers say, great idea, school board, we'd like what you're doing.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, good morning, Jack, and good morning, Mr. Hewitt. I just want to say one thing. I don't really want to ask a question. I'm all in favor of what Mr. Hewitt is doing. He also has a responsibility to the taxpayer, and I think that teachers, along with everybody else, have to learn to hold the line a little.
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Minister, short comment and a quick question. First of all, I'd like you to send a message to the school boards and the Teachers Federation for me. I am sick and tired of this whole issue. For what, 2 years now, we've been shoved at this issue at us. And I am, through you, hopefully wanting to tell them, I've had enough of left-wing school boards and NDP teachers federations telling me I got to dip into my pocket to pay the teachers more money. Now, I'm not afraid of the school book issue. Let's get the money out there for the books. But the question is this, Mr. Minister, on this issue, when are you prepared to go to the polls? Because I want it settled, please.
Well, Jack, I think it's fair to say that I want to work with the school boards, and I want to work with the teachers, the Teachers Association. Our common goal, for crying out loud, is the education of our kids. That's our common goal. Why are we getting all this political rhetoric?
Because we went through a period of affluence. The affluence vanished from underneath us. You're going the good old social credit way, whereas the NDP might go another way if they could find the money. But when is the election going to be?
Well, there's only one man who can answer that question, and
He's
one day
not
he'll
here
tell
this
us.
morning.
No.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, both of you. I would just like to know the answer to a question here as to why the general public cannot be alerted as to the range of teachers' salaries. Recently, I was at a meeting. A woman announced to me that teachers only get $15,000 a year. They deserve a raise.
Oh,
and
nonsense.
That's ridiculous.
Nonsense. Show me your graph of teachers' salaries. I'm sure you've got one with you.
Also, Mr. Webster, I'd like to pay a tribute to the high school in the Ladner area.
Hold on a second, ma'am, while we see this graph. Now, teachers' salaries.
No, Jack, the teachers are professionals, and I'm not teacher bashing, but I just want it so the taxpayer understands and the teachers understand. A beginning teacher comes in approximately $22,000, $23,000, plus their benefits and their pension. Yeah. After a period of time, the average teacher gets up to about $37,000. I think the average wage across the province is $37,000. When they reach the top of their increment grid, they're now up to $40-some-odd-thousand. Vice principals go higher because they have this administration cost. Principals get up into the $60,000 range. Now, I'm not saying they're overpaid. I'm just saying that in this time where the economy is just recovering, you can't ask for more dollars.
Now, but was it Ladner you mentioned, Delta?
I would like to pay a tribute to the principal, the counselors, and the teachers in the Ladner area. It's an absolutely outstanding high school. They've done extremely well in the scholarship standings, and it just seems that those teachers and that principal are totally dedicated to
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
I have two questions. I have it from a Vancouver school teacher that, who tells me that while other employees of the city have received raises, albeit small ones, that teachers have not received anything since 1982, and in fact are receiving 12% less, due perhaps to inflation. I was wondering how the minister would consider this, what kind of an effect this would have on the morale of the teachers and in education in Vancouver generally.
Well, I can appreciate a teacher would like to see increases because of the cost of living, but he had some pretty massive increases that came about in 81, 82, 10 or 12% one year, 17 the other. When he says they're getting 12% less, he's, I guess, relating to the cost of living and how it's increased. But over the past years, they have been getting increases. They've been getting their increments. Last year, as one lady phoned up and said, what about the increases for 85? They got, I believe, approximately 1.5% in their increment move up through the grid, and then approximately 1.3% in most school districts for a salary increase.
Anyway,
so they are getting it.
We're not out of the woods yet. You're going to bring in legislation in the current session to allow school boards to tax additional taxes on property.
That's correct. Residential property.
You don't want to see any wage increases to teachers at all except for increments.
And I'll be sending a letter to the school boards to that effect.
You're going to attempt to change the fiscal framework so that it comes up to 85, 86 levels for the teachers from here on.
I'm prepared to do that if I've got support of the school boards in the province.
And you will guarantee a supply of textbooks even if you have to dip into the Special Excellence Fund for that money.
That's correct.
My thanks to Jim Hewitt, Minister of Education. How many portfolios have you held?
This is my fourth. Agriculture, energy, consumer and corporate affairs, education.
And education. Well, who knows what will happen after the next election. My thanks to Jim Hewitt. I'm going to talk to Terry Mailloux of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association of Canada after the break.
And I'm chairman, I'm a director of the association, and I'm chairman of the patent committee and have been since '75, so.
And
30 seconds.
the price of prescription drugs and the battle between the brand name manufacturers and the generic manufacturers has been in front of the public for years. And just the other day, Jack Kay of the Canadian Drug Manufacturers Generic Association was on here warning that if the Tory government introduces new legislation to give more power to restrict generic drugs, it would be bad for you, the consumer. And that you saved $211 million last year on the cheaper generic drugs. Here is Terry Mailloux, who is the president of Pacific Isotopes Pharmaceuticals, a new firm being founded in Vancouver, and that's a subsidiary of the Terry Fox Medical Research Foundation. But more appropriately for me this morning, he is chairman of the patent committee has been since 1975, a director of the association of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association of Canada. Now, you therefore represent the evil forces of the foreign-owned drug companies who want to prevent the generic Canadian companies from copycatting your finds and selling them to the public at a cheaper rate. Is that a correct interpretation?
I represent the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, which also includes a company like ours, which is a small startup operation and is Canadian. And I really resent this multinational aspect.
Oh, come now, there aren't many Canadian pharmaceutical manufacturing companies.
We have about 6 members that are Canadian companies, and we are starting, and I would hope that our company grows big enough to be a multinational, but that's not really the issue.
But the multinationals control the drug business in Canada.
Multinational companies control the pharmaceutical industry, if you'd like, if you want to use those terms, throughout the world.
Correct.
And they do the basic research that brings you the new drugs, which are used to cure the illnesses that ultimately we all will suffer.
Yes, I know, but there's not much research done in Canada.
There is about $85 million research done in Canada.
Let's get that.
And I think that has a great potential to grow.
Now, there is a vast difference in prices of drugs as between generic and brand name.
There is a difference in price. That difference on some drugs is quite large. On other drugs, it's quite small. But there is a difference in price.
Valium and diazepam, $260 a hundred and $40 a hundred.
Yes, that's a very good example. That's taking one of the oldest drugs around and saying, here's the difference, that level to that level.
But that's good for the public, isn't it? That cheaper drug.
I think that the public is served 2 ways. I think getting good drugs at a reasonable price, having price competition at a certain point in time, yes, definitely. But I think the public is also served by having new drugs and finding new cures, because we haven't solved all the illnesses of the world. We've made great strides, but we have not solved all the illnesses that are there.
Well, now, I'm not going to put the mantle of holiness on you and that your sole aim in life is to solve illnesses of the world. The multinationals want to make a buck too, but the point I want to make is that when the generic drugs were given power to copycat, they couldn't copycat in Canada a new drug until after it had been 4 years on the shelf, right?
No, I would like to correct that. The average length of time that drugs had been on the market before a generic came in, up until very recently, was about 9.9 years. That's the average length of time. Tagamet, which was a major advance and a major breakthrough, was copied in a period of 4.5 years.
And many others were copied in 4 years.
Very few, very few. What has happened now is that the generic companies have become a good resource. They were very strong, they were very big. After all, you know, the generic companies, the top 2 generic companies, are the biggest companies in terms of prescriptions filled in Canada.
Thank God.
Well, maybe,
Look
thank
at the
God.
saving of money, but the point I'm making is that your people are now lobbying to prevent the generic people from copying your drugs in, say, a period of 4 years. You want extended to 10, don't you?
That is correct.
In other words, you want an exclusive market for all new products at your vast prices without the generics being able to come in. That would put up the price of these drugs, wouldn't it?
It doesn't put up the price of the drugs. What it does is that we will get our price, and there's 2 forms of competition. There's not only the generic drug that's on the market that comes in and copies you using your research and using all your resources. There's also the other products that are on the market. And there is a very controlling force in the provincial drug formularies. So there is really no just big ball game that you just come out and say, hey, I'll charge what the traffic will bear.
No.
I put the sky up to the top. You can't do that.
But $211 million we saved in British Columbia last year, according to Kay, by buying generic drugs.
You did not save $211 million in British Columbia, believe me. In fact, if you looked at the figures of true drugs where there was a compulsory licensed product available on the market, the actual savings in 1983 were about $125 million. Nothing to be sneezed at.
Certainly not.
Not at all.
And if you had a monopoly control of the market, God knows what the prices would go to.
I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure. I think that drug manufacturers have a social responsibility and live up to it.
Anyway, at the moment, you're lobbying the federal government to prevent the generic who produce cheaper drugs from copying your drugs until after a period of 10 years.
That is correct.
That's your aim and your object.
That is our aim and our object, and in return for that, I see a dramatic increase in the amount of research that is done in this country, and I see job opportunities for our scientists. Because Canada is a good place. There's some good people here, but you know what happens to them?
They go to the States.
Most of them go to the States. Or they go to Switzerland. Or they go, if they can speak German, they go to Germany.
That's because the major development of research is done in those countries.
It's because the jobs are available in those countries. So why not make the jobs available here? Take our little group in BC. What are we trying to do? We are hoping for that law, and I think it will help us, if Minister Cote goes through and makes it, that we will start the Biomedical Research Center right at UBC, and we'll have 50 to 100 scientists.
They could protect you by specific legislation, but when we were being flooded by the 66 multinational subsidiaries, I don't want to start quoting you the prices, but Valium in this country, diazepam is $260. Your Valium, diazepam is $260, Valium is $40. What's the price in the States for Valium?
The price is somewhat higher.
I'm told it's $200.
Well, I can't even say, and I think that, you know, that's a question that I'd have to duck because I don't know the price in the States. And I think, frankly, what I'm concerned about is what benefits will come and accrue here. What can we get? And I'm also concerned about what's going to happen in the future.
But of course, the greatest concern of the public is the price levels.
Well, that's because people have done a nice lobby also saying to them that the only thing you're interested in is the price. And I'm saying, no, you're not.
You're not suggesting they're of lower quality.
I am suggesting that there are tests done to assure that, and if they're smart, they'll make sure they're of good quality.
Sure.
But there is a growing doubt that products are really interchangeable in the whole system.
Well, doctors in British Columbia are one of the few places where the doctors have the right to say no substitute, isn't it?
Well, they have in other places, and they have to write it, and there's a lot of programs to prevent it, and you know, that's a question, I think, of a consumer decision, and I think the consumer should make a better educated decision.
But anyway, if the Tories pass this through, you'll be happy.
I'll be reasonably happy, certainly.
And the public will be done in the eye again.
I don't think the public will be done in the eye. I think they'll be doing all right.
Let's bring in Frank Archer on another aspect of this intriguing story after the break.
What's happened with that?
McNeil.
Well, that was the killer, remember?
Yeah.
Yeah. This one here, having convinced.
When I interviewed Jack Kay of the Canadian Drug Manufacturers Association the other day, he picked up a question of mine and gloated over the fact that it's the detail men for the ethical companies, the brand name companies, that shower the doctors with brainwashing propaganda, golf balls and this and that and the next thing, so they don't forget the name of the brand name drug. But he forgot to tell me, and I was talking to him in Calgary this morning, that while the generic drug manufacturers don't lobby the doctors, they do lobby the pharmacists with little innovative gimmicks and hidden bonuses and trips to Paris and silver sets and television sets and whatnot. So I asked Frank Archer of the Pharmacists Society of British Columbia to come here this morning and tell me how much in the way of payola is offered to druggists and whether or not you people accept it and whether you welcome it or whether it's an added cost on my cheaper generic drugs or any other kind of drugs.
Okay, this is going on all across the country. It's not just restricted to British Columbia. On the surface of it, we welcome it, but only on the condition that our members pass on those savings to the people that pay for the drugs.
Oh, well, now that's a little bit too slick for me. If I get a television set or a VCR or something, you say that as a pharmacist, if I'm going to behave properly, I must pass the saving of that on by reducing prescription prices.
What we've got in British Columbia is a little unique. In the rest of Canada, the pharmacists negotiate with their provincial governments as to what they will accept as a drug cost. And if the government says, we will accept 5 cents per tablet for this particular drug, it doesn't really matter if the pharmacist pays 6 cents or 5 cents or 4 cents or 3 cents. He gets paid 5 cents a tablet for that drug.
But in British Columbia?
In British Columbia, it's a lot different. The agreement we have with our government is that we will charge what we pay for that drug. Now, in the rest of the country, these inducements to purchase are of no concern to anybody. The government will pay 5 cents, and it doesn't matter if a pharmacist takes a trip to Paris or not. In British Columbia, it is a concern both to us and the government, because our interpretation of actual acquisition cost is that the pharmacist must take these considerations, must calculate these considerations when they calculate their drug cost.
Okay, let me understand this. When you're making up my prescription for me, you will charge the government the actual drug cost, whatever it costs you, the net cost to you.
That's right.
And then you will add your prescription fee.
That's right.
And your prescription fee is what you make your money on.
That's right.
And, of course, on your drugs. Oh, no.
There's no profit made on the drugs whatsoever.
Absolutely no profit made on the drugs at all.
That's right. Now, the problem is that these incentives, which have increased in frequency for the last 2 years, are making, we consider, are making our agreement with government, are putting it in jeopardy.
Now, who makes these incentive offers, apart from Jack Kay and the generic people? Do the brand name people make the same offers?
Yes, they do. The brand name companies and the generic companies make these offers, and it's restricted to those products where there's more than one brand of the same drug.
In other words, it's a competition with the druggist for his favor between the brand name and the generic drug.
Yes, at one time the drug manufacturers would concentrate all their effort on convincing the physician to prescribe their particular brand of drug. When the provinces allowed product selection, which means that the pharmacist has the ability to choose a less expensive brand, some drug manufacturers then chose to put their efforts toward convincing the pharmacist to stock and dispense their particular brand.
All right, if a doctor writes no substitutions on a prescription, does that mean that you, the druggist, must fill the brand name and not give, perhaps the poverty-stricken client, not on medical, not on pharmacare, must buy the brand name?
That's correct, and we respect the right of the doctors to do this when it is the doctor's intent to have that particular brand dispensed. What we do object to, though, are some brand name manufacturers who are supplying doctors with prescription pads pre-printed with the words "no substitution." We've told our members that, in our opinion, they need not heed those words unless the doctor makes some physical notation, and that's what he means.
If it says printed on it, no substitution, the patient can go to the pharmacist and say, I can't afford such and such, I'll take the generic.
I doubt whether the patient would even take a look at the prescription. What we're saying to our members is that we don't think that they're being put in jeopardy by substituting in those cases. In many cases, our members have told us that they phoned the doctor saying, "Did you really mean that?" And the doctor is not even aware of the wording on the pad. It was given to him free, and he accepted it as a gift, and he did not look at the details.
These doctors should waken up. Okay,
Well, it's a free prescription pad.
Yeah, I as a patient, though, I've got my prescription from a doctor, and he says no substitutions, and I can't afford the $145. I say, how much is the generic? And the guy says $40. Can I, as a patient, say, give me the generic?
Well, the pharmacist has to follow the directions of the physician. In that case, I would suggest that most pharmacists will phone the physician.
The doctor.
Say, did you really mean that? And if the physician says, no, I didn't even know that was on.
So therefore, this business of incentives, kind of these promotional campaigns, what's the biggest incentive? Any cash rebates?
There are cash rebates. There is an allowed rebate as an inducement for prompt payment. That's a normal commercial rebate.
2% at 15
2%
days.
15, net 30, exactly.
Right.
Now, our members have told us that some drug manufacturers are coming in and offering them incentives far in excess of 210, net 30. And it is not, in their estimation, anything more than an inducement to purchase that drug. It's not an inducement to pay early. It's an inducement to purchase the drug.
Purchase that drug. And this therefore comes from both generic and brand name
That's right.
drug.
It's an artifact of the system. Now, this is a very, very small problem at the moment. What we've got through our system are drug costs that are at least 8% cheaper than the next nearest province in Canada.
But if everything was generic, our drug costs would go down an incredible amount, wouldn't they?
Once only.
Once only.
Well, you can only make the savings once. You can't expect the price to be lower the next year and lower the year after. You can go to all generic if you want. But if you did that, I'm sure that you'd be probably looking for new drugs down the road that weren't there. There is something to...
Oh, the multinationals would continue doing the research for the sake of humanity regardless, wouldn't they? Eh?
Who's going to pay?
Unless it's a profit.
Who's going to pay?
Exactly, I agree with that. So you've had 2 years of this kind of annoying hucksterism by both brand and generic drug manufacturers.
That's right.
Would you like to see it stopped altogether?
Either stopped or some... what we did 3 weeks ago, we held a conference in Vancouver.
On this?
Yes, we had 90 drug manufacturers in.
Gosh.
Now,
and?
Okay, the gist of the conference was that nobody wanted a change in marketing practices, so-called Las Vegas gambling rules, right? Anything goes. But the caveat was that everything had to be on top of the table and not under the table. There's two possible conclusions to this. The first one is that perhaps the drug manufacturers should be forced to calculate actual acquisition cost for the pharmacist. The pharmacist would still declare it. The second thing is perhaps they should be giving the pharmacist all the information he needs in order to simply calculate actual acquisition cost. Sometimes it's virtually impossible. If you're given 2 pieces of silver for a $200 drug order, is the pharmacist to go to the Vancouver Sun and find out what silver is trading for that day to make a value? Perhaps it's in the form of a silver bracelet with his name on it. That's of no earthly use if his name was Frank to you.
If income tax looks at this, it'll be personal benefit to the druggist and they'll have to pay tax on it.
Well, that's our worry too. There was one drug manufacturer giving $25 in $5 gas coupons as a promotional incentive for purchasing his drug. And there was no indication to the pharmacist that he had ever received it. And one of our members came down and just threw them on my desk and said, "Look what I'm being handed now. I don't want these damn things."
And it shows in somebody's books.
Well, I imagine it shows an expense in the.
One final question: would you like to see Tidball or Nielsen or the provincial government say an end to this hucksterism when it is not reflected in the dropping of the price of drugs?
No, because I think we can do that ourselves. We've had 12 years of cooperation with the provincial government, and we have solved all the problems that have arisen.
Are you going to tell your members no more of this?
No, we're not. We're going to try and get the drug manufacturers to put these deals on top of the table rather than under the table.
Very good. And you've both been very illuminating this morning. Terry Mailloux from Pacific Isotopes and Frank Archer. Short segment of telephone calls. Now. We're on drugs. We're not on drugs, we're talking about prescription drugs. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Webster.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I was just wondering what kind of tax breaks these drug manufacturers are getting from the federal or the provincial governments presently.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. No idea. Can you tell me any special tax breaks apart from research?
Well, I think just the general research tax breaks that one gets. That's the only system that's there.
But this would be a great breaks for the pharmaceutical brand name companies if they get their exclusivity on new drugs.
On new drugs, yeah.
Extended for 10 years. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Me?
Yes.
Okay, Chad. I'm the foreigner from Irvine that you spoke to a while ago.
Forget your biographical background. Ask me a question.
No, the question I got is, why is a prescription I got recently cost me, what the drug cost was 45 cents, and the dispensing fee was $6.25.
Right in Frank's lap.
Okay, it's the only type of consumer complaint I get anymore. Since 1979, pharmacists have been charging the same dispensing fee in their pharmacies for all prescriptions dispensed, regardless of drug cost. So if this gentleman with his 45-cent prescription was given a drug that was $125, it would still be the same professional fee.
Is that for each separate prescription?
That's right.
If
now,
I have 4 items on one prescription...
4 fees.
4 fees.
4 fees. Now, the prescription fees vary between stores, but they're exactly the same within each pharmacy.
As a matter of fact, I'm glad you reminded me of that. Wasn't there an outfit offering 3 something per prescription?
Yes, there was a Save on Food and Drugs in Richmond came out and advertised in the media their professional fee.
And they're still doing that?
They're still charging it, but they're not advertising it anymore.
Oh, I've got to get that nuance correctly. In other words, they can charge it, but you won't let them advertise it.
Oh, it's not up to us. It's our college. Our licensing body took them to discipline for advertising in the media. This was contrary to the bylaws of the Pharmacists Act.
That's an obvious breach of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, if I might say so, and we may take it at once to the Supreme Court of Canada.
I believe that's probably where it would have gone had they been found guilty.
I see. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Yes. The second gentleman who talked on the show here said that the British Columbia Pharmaceutical only charged the customer, the consumer, what they bought for the prescription.
Correct.
For the medicine from the manufacturer. Now, I have been a user of Tagamet. Now, Tagamet here in this province is very expensive. Now, would you please explain me why have I paid less for Tagamet in Ontario? If you're telling me that in other provinces they are earning or making 5 cents per pill more than the manufacturer is charging them for, then why am I paying less for it there and more here where you're supposedly not earning anything on the medication? And it didn't have anything to do with the filling prescription fee.
Okay, with that particular brand, when it came on the market, it was about $30 a hundred. And about 4.5 years later, I believe, Terry, or 3.5 years.
Excuse me, it was $39, nearly to $40 a hundred.
Okay, $39 to $40 a hundred.
Okay, actually it was $30 plus the professional fee. A generic drug came on the market. Cimetidine came on the market, and I believe it was below $20. Tagamet reduced its SKF reduced its price of Tagamet down to, I believe, about $12, and the generic went down to, I believe, about $8. Now, what happened was that there were problems internationally with SKF, and they put their prescription or their price back to $30. Okay, so in British Columbia, the price of Tagamet actually went down to about $12, but it's gone back to $30. Now, this lady obviously was in Ontario when it was down, and it was down here as well.
But there's another interesting aspect to that. The cimetidine, when it was $30 here and went down to $12, that caused trouble in the United States, where people wondered why it was still $30 in the States.
That's right.
So SKF, I think, brought the price up to $30 in Canada.
What was happening was they were manufacturing it in the United States, bringing it north to Canada for formulation. And the New York Times found out that in Canada they were selling it to pharmacists for about $12 a hundred, yet they were still charging $30 a hundred in the United States. So in order to protect their much greater market in the United States, it's 10 times what it is in Canada, they put their price back to $30 in Canada. Now, they still had to maintain some sales in Canada. So what did they do? They had a prescription or a deal to pharmacists which sent them free to London, England. And that's how they got the sales back up. Now, they were able to maintain their sales at $30 a hundred, and the inducement came out of the advertising budget.
See, that's the terrible thing. The prices in the United States, where they don't seem to have the same effect of genetic competition, are so much higher by hundreds of % for good drugs.
Well, prices are higher in the United States. Canada is, I think we've been very fortunate in prices, and that's not only from generic drugs, but also single-source drugs. But I'll tell you frankly, we as an association, and certainly I do not condone the practices that are being talked about. I would also hope that the caller did get, in fact, the comparable drug, did get Tagamet in both places.
Yeah, I suppose so. But that's why I'm sold on generic drugs, because they make you bring your prices down, or they give me an alternate.
Well, if it comes at the right point in time, if it comes at the point where you've got your investment back and are making more investments, God bless, you're in the marketplace, compete. If you don't want to compete, get out.
Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes, I disagree with these multi-million-dollar drug companies having a monopoly on the generic companies. I haven't once heard anybody say anything about the customer. We should have the right to choose between a brand name and a generic. And if we can't afford it, why shouldn't we get the generic?
You can, and I made that.
Comes in, Jack. We won't be able to. We're just stuck. Like soon they'll be telling us to buy what brand of gas and what brand of cigarette. It's monopoly.
Agreed entirely from that point of view, that if the Tory government passes this legislation giving a 10-year exclusivity on all new drugs from now on and prevents the generics from copying, that would be against the interests of the ordinary guy, wouldn't it?
Against one of the interests, but it doesn't cover both.
How do you feel about it? You don't care?
If they're given 10 years of exclusivity, in the short run, nothing will happen. In the long run, it will probably mean that prices of drugs will go up.
I'm grateful for both your presences here this morning, to Terry Mailloux of Pacific Isotopes and to Frank Archer of the Pharmacists
Society.
Pharmacists Society of British Columbia. Next, I'm going to talk about refugees. Go be refugees, young folks. After the break.
Thank you.
Minutes a day.
I wanted him to see. Here it is.
Oh. I'll get out. You do the extra. Okay. Now.
You okay, Steve? Sure. So anyway, what we really need to establish it is sort of a status report on what's happening.
30 seconds coming back.
First,
okay,
where the refugees are being created.
Do my best. I could sit naked from the waist down here to be comfortable in the summertime, because all I'm going to see should be is from here up. You're the next newspaper man. The average Canadian, especially in the West, where we've got such a high rate of unemployment, tends to worry about immigration. But do you divide in your mind the difference between the immigration, family unification, for instance, and refugees? Well, we chance to be fairly sophisticated about it this morning, because I have here Oystein Stabrun, who's the representative in Canada of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and Sharon Rusu, who's a consultant on this in High Commission for Refugees. Now, how many refugees are there throughout the world?
We have 10 million refugees throughout the world today.
Are that people who would like to get out where they are and come to another country?
No, those are refugees. Those are people that have already fled their country of origin and are refugees.
And are we handling this problem in any satisfactory at all as people of the world?
Well, it's being handled as best we can, but these are the fallout of conflict areas, conflict centers, hotspots of the world.
Central America, Afghanistan, Ethiopia?
Those are a few of those places, yes.
All right, now what's Canada's position on this? Are we one of the most generous countries when it comes to taking refugees?
Yes, you are. Canada is one of the leading countries in supporting the refugee cause.
Is that a large part of our immigration total, Sharon?
No, it's not. No, in fact, it's not. We're talking about the difference between probably 115,000 immigration total for 1986 and 16,000 refugees. The 16,000 would be the refugee total for 1986.
And what kind of people are these refugees? Are they total disasters from devastated countries who must kind of live off the public purse when they get here?
No, not necessarily, because you see, what we have to look at in terms of how Canada selects refugees, the backdrop for that selection is always a passing of a certain criteria, regardless of the fact that refugees, because of the nature of the way they leave their country, leave without anything and are forced out. Nonetheless, in order to come to Canada, to be resettled here, and only a very small portion of the refugee total internationally are resettled, they still have to pass a certain criteria, which means that virtually we take the creme de la creme of the group that is destined for resettlement.
Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does.
In other words, those who survive the devastation in their own country and have enough wit and resources to get to a refugee place where they can apply for Canada are the better immigrants.
Well, they don't apply for Canada. Refugees don't have a choice, in fact. They leave their country of origin because they're being persecuted, but they don't have a choice. They are not selecting Canada.
Canada selects.
Canada is selecting them.
Indeed.
Exactly.
Now, where do we rank in refugees? You know, are we?
Well, out of the 10 million, 97% are settled, are taken care of in the conflict regions. Only 3% are being resettled in the Western world, in the developing countries.
Wouldn't it be better and more politically desirable in Canada merely to send more foreign aid there and say, here, we'll help the refugees, but God knows we don't need any more unemployed in this country today?
Mr. Webster, there's a problem with that, and I think that you're absolutely right. If we could, and from the point of view of the refugee, absolutely. The refugee would rather stay either on site or, most of all, return to his own country. And absolutely, that would be a wonderful way if it could be done. But what we're talking about when we're talking about resettlement is rescue. And it's very clearly those people cannot, for the protection of their lives, remain in the places where they are. And that is why they are being moved.
Would the best example of refugees to Canada be these refugees from Vietnam?
Well, that would be a large group, yes. And perhaps in terms of profile, in terms of their visibility in a country, yes, yes.
What do we do for them in this country? I mean, we get all kinds of anguished wails from people who can't cope nowadays. Do we have a good system of looking after refugees? Do they get priority over Canadians for training and housing and whatnot?
Absolutely not.
You sure?
No, they're part of the queue. As a matter of fact, when a refugee comes into this country, the queuing system is really is in place and it's stringent. I mean, in the sense that if they are to access the limited spaces available, say for example recertification training or for skills training, they have to compete with Canadians. Mm-hmm. And there are no special...
You used to get many complaints about new Canadians, immigrants especially, squeezing unemployed Canadians out of manpower programs. Maybe they've corrected that.
Well, no, and I think that typically Canadians, as in a general way, respond when the economy is tight and when there are problems of that nature in a country. When you're facing a deep recession, when you're facing problems, certainly that's going to be, someone has to be scapegoated. It's much simpler to look at
the scapegoat, newcomers. The immigrant,
absolutely,
the newcomer.
Absolutely.
Tell me, is that as UN High Commission, do you recommend how many refugees we should take and how they are looked after?
No, that's purely a Canadian decision.
What do you do?
Here in Canada? Well, first of all, we try to raise the refugee profile. We try to tell the people who the public of Canada, who these people really are, where they come from.
And what their needs are.
And what their needs are. And we sit down with the Canadian government and look and share with Canada the global issues, the global problems.
Let me ask you a question. Are we going to get a mass of refugees from South Africa?
I don't think so, but it's very difficult to forecast refugee moves.
How about the Iran-Iraq war? No? Ethiopia, Eritrea?
Well, Sudan is taking the bulk of the refugees together with Somalia, from Ethiopia.
So we're really getting none of the multitudes of starving from Africa as such?
No, we are not.
And how about Southeast Asia? Have we fulfilled our quotas for Southeast Asia?
There are still 160,000 refugees languishing in camps in Southeast Asia.
Should we be taking more of them?
We should continue to take refugees from Southeast Asia, definitely.
And we have none from Afghanistan? A couple, I believe.
250 this last year, but they were all family reunion cases.
Who had relatives in this country before?
Yes.
Questions about refugees to my two distinguished guests. Oystein Stabrun. Is that about right?
That's correct.
And Sharon Rusu. I'll call her Annie. After the break. Did you ever stay in that house? No.
Next door.
Next door?
Next door.
Ah, no, I won't tell a story. No, I won't tell a story. No, I won't. I just as soon forget some of these things. Go ahead to my refugee experts and spokespersons.
Yes, my question, Jack, is to the lady who sort of stated that by definition refugees come without assets. And if the Ugandans were indeed refugees, and I'm not sure of that, I happened to be working in a chartered bank when they came, and they came with all kinds of hidden assets that quickly were converted into cash and had very strong financial background.
What's your point?
My point is that refugees are not necessarily without assets.
Oh no, and the immigrants we're getting from Hong Kong now under the entrepreneurial class are sometimes extraordinarily wealthy. Is that a bad thing, Sharon?
Absolutely not, and I didn't mean to give that impression at all. I think what I meant was that, in fact, what we're looking at here is a number of people who come with nothing. Of course, within that context, there are going to be people like the Ugandan Asians who came out with considerable material assets. What I would like to add to that for everyone's benefit is the fact that refugees come with incredible resources in themselves as well.
Go ahead, please. Hello.
Hello.
That's you.
I would like to know, on the numbers game of immigrants, now say we get 100,000 immigrants in, of that portion, proportionately, it's down there not right. I'm not discriminating and I'm not prejudiced, but what I want to know is why in this world can we not get Czechoslovakians, Poles, any of those people are really desperate to get out of their countries, and they're languishing in refugee camps in Europe someplace.
How about, let's ask Oystein about that. European refugees, is there a great number of them at all, or is it merely a desire to leave certain countries?
At this time, they are definitely in the minority. The majority of refugees are to be found in the third world. But Canada do take a number of refugees from Europe, yes.
From Eastern Europe?
From Eastern Europe. And when they jumped ships here, we had an outbreak of ship jumping here a couple of years back, mostly Polish. They were all seemingly given ministerial permits quite quickly.
Okay.
So very few in Eastern Europe, he says. Maybe lots would like to get out, but they're not languishing in camps there.
Well, I heard this guy downtown, and he was saying that he stayed in a camp for a year, 18 months.
That's nothing in comparison to those who are staying in camps in Thailand and the Sudan for 3 to 5 years.
10 years.
10 years.
Is the Sudan still warfare in the south?
The Sudan is still having a conflict in the south, yes. They also have close to 1 million refugees. That's a nation of 17 million.
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack.
Yes.
Yes, I fully support your refugee programs for displaced persons and whatnot, but what about all these illegal refugees that have been coming into Canada with forged passports through Amsterdam and these other countries?
You mean the people who come in on the West German, come from Poland on West German passports and get transit visas to Canada, and we don't know what to do with them?
That's right. Why are they being allowed to stay here?
Well, that's not a question, that's an administrative question, I think, for which you're not to blame, are you?
No, not necessarily, but...
No, I think if a person is found to be a refugee, he is a refugee regardless of how he comes, how he arrives.
We have a very delicate situation in Canada now, though, with regard to those who support the establishment of the Khalistani state.
Yeah.
And I believe because of it, we have normal negotiations and, relations with India, so therefore no one who advocates Khalistan can be a refugee because Canada says that's India's business.
Province.
Yes.
Isn't that right?
Well, Canada determines the status of the asylum seeker.
Of the asylum seeker. In other words, you couldn't come in from Britain and say, I'm a refugee from Britain, because they'd just laugh at you.
You can. We have had. You can. We have people who seek asylum from the United States, but they have to go.
That I can understand, but the United Kingdom, I refuse to believe.
But from Ireland, yes, we've had asylum
Ireland.
seekers.
I mean, that's a different kettle
We've had
of fish
from Britain
altogether.
as well. But they have to go through the process.
Of being established as a refugee at the point of entry.
In Canada.
But you establish refugee status at the other end.
We establish, or Canada established refugee status...
At the other end as well.
Well, at the other end as well, but also after arrival in Canada.
That's a wrinkle I didn't think about. Go ahead, please.
Hello, yes. I would like to know, I came in late into the program, so I missed a lot of it. I'd like to know how Canada can afford to bring in these people. We can't afford to feed our own people.
Food banks in Vancouver.
Excuse me?
Okay, I was saying food banks in Vancouver.
Food banks in Vancouver, because all these refugees come over here, and what do they see? They see a bunch of Vancouvers unemployed and going hungry and homeless.
Well, not that bad, mind you. It's not like a camp in Cambodia. What do you say to that?
I think that's a very relevant point that you've made, Mr. Webster. It's not like a camp in Cambodia. Secondly, what we're looking at is a very minor portion of the world's refugees. We're looking at 16,000 to come to Canada in this year out of 115,000 for our total immigrant population intake, and we're looking at 10 million refugees internationally. Also, with respect to that, I think that we have to take express the knowledge that Canada took a position with respect to refugees in 1951 when they signed the convention, the United Nations Convention, and that places us in an obligatory context with respect to our humanitarian response and what that means. Also, refugees bring, as I said before, incredible resources, and they are themselves survivors of incredible hardship.
What's our quota? Do we have a quota for refugees? Did you?
16? Yes, and this year government-sponsored refugees who numbered 12,000, with another privately sponsored 4,000, so 16,000.
We've just cut back in foreign aid in the budget for the year ahead, have we not?
Yes, slightly in certain areas. Or we've stayed the same.
I think it's down 300 million. Go ahead, please.
No, Jack, I have two comments to make. The first one is that you check the welfare lines really, and you never find immigrants or refugees in the welfare lines. By virtue of being immigrants and by being refugees, these people are much more hardworking and are willing to do any kind of job. My second comment is that the whole North-South conflict of injustice and unequal distribution, we are responsible for it here in Canada, and as human beings, it's high time we took responsibility for other people who are victims of this injustice.
Thank you, ma'am. I think that was well said.
Hear, hear, bravo.
Go ahead, please.
I was wondering if they knew what chances Robert Tatai from Ocala has for refugee status.
I didn't get that. Say it again quickly.
Chances does Robert Satayakam in Ocala, what are his chances for refugee status in Canada?
Robert Satayakam is a subject which has been through the courts here in Spain, which he has sought on criminal charges in the United States, and is claiming status as a refugee and also as an Indian. I would just as soon leave that to the courts in this country. People always get in to grind their own little axes. I'm very grateful for your presence this morning. Oystein Stabrun, a UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and Sharon Rusu, a little gal from Saskatchewan. Oh, that's a wrong thing to say.
But no.
Consultant to the High Commissioner of Refugees, and I'll be back after the break.
Expo.
Couple of good things for tomorrow. One is Bill Dom, you know, the capital punishment MP from Peterborough. There's going to be a free vote on it, presumably, this government. And we're going to deal with a bit of a crisis in accommodations for Expo. I don't think the bed and breakfast thing is working right, and I'm going to have John de West of Res West here and Claude Richmond, the Minister of Tourism. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. precisely.
Expo 86, 44 days to go.
Expo visitors crisis. Are you prepared to help? Tomorrow at 9 a.m. precisely.